Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey not into the grand strategies of generals or the sweeping arcs of political upheaval, but into something far more immediate, more visceral, the relentless, dehumanizing experience of a German soldier on the Eastern Front, specifically during the unforgiving years of 1941 to 1942. This is a story of mud, of cold, of hunger, and of the profound ways in which a landscape and a war can strip away everything familiar. We're about to explore a reality where the very ground beneath your feet became an enemy, where the air itself was a weapon, and where survival was a daily exhausting act of defiance against the elements and an unyielding foe. Imagine for a moment that you are there. You are there. Not in some grand, sweeping panorama of battle, but right here in the small, miserable, immediate reality of a wet, cold, unforgiving landscape in the autumn of 1941. The initial immersion is absolute stripping away any romantic notions of conflict. Around your ankles, the earth is not merely damp. It is a perpetually churning slush, a thick, dark, liquid embrace that sucks at your boots with every hesitant step. The air, far from being crisp, is heavy with a faint metallic scent of oil mingling disturbingly with the acrid sting of gunpowder. And beneath it all, a truly unidentifiable grim odor persists, a pervasive hint of something organic and decaying, a smell that clings to the inside of your nose and refuses to be dismissed. It's the scent of a ground that has seen too much, absorbed too much, and now gives it all back in a silent, malodorous accusation. The wind, a constant, unseen tormentor, slices through your standard-issue wool greatcoat as if it were spun from tissue paper. It doesn't just chill you. It seems to find the very marrow of your bones, seeking out any warmth you might have desperately hoarded. Your boots, issued months ago, were perhaps once a sturdy, respectable pair of leather, but now they are perpetually soaked, heavy, waterlogged sponges that squelch with every step. There is no hope of drying them, no respite from the cold, damp embrace of their sodden interior. They have become an extension of the mud itself, rather than a barrier against it. You, the soldier, are no longer a man in uniform. You are quite simply a walking, shivering clump of damp wool and regret. Every movement is stiff. Every breath plumes visibly in the frigid air, and every muscle aches with a cold that has taken up permanent residence. This isn't just discomfort. It's a fundamental redefinition of your physical being. And then there is the mud. Oh, the mud. It is not merely on the ground. It is omnipresent. It has worked its way into the very fabric of your existence. You feel it in your socks, a grainy, cold paste that rubs relentlessly against your skin. It has seeped into the sleeves of your tunic, clinging to the inside of your elbows. You find it somehow in your canteen lid, coating the lip of the metal, a gritty addition to every desperate sip of lukewarm water. It is a universal constant, a grim, all-encompassing medium through which life, or what passes for it, is conducted. But this is no ordinary mud. This is a unique quality of the mud. It's not slippery, which would at least offer the swift, decisive drama of a fall. No, this is a thick, sticky, black sludge that possesses an almost sentient will. It clings to you not like dirt, but like a profound sense of guilt, whispering a silent, insidious refrain with every pull of your foot. You're not leaving, not easily anyway. It's an adversary that doesn't require bullets or bombs. It demands simply patience, endurance, and an acceptance of its relentless, suffocating embrace. It's an inescapable companion reminding you with every squelch, every heavy drag of your foot, that this landscape is an enemy just as formidable just as unyielding as any human foe you might encounter. This, you realize, is the grim reality of Operation Barbarossa, a name that at home conjured images of swift, decisive victory. It is autumn 1941, and you are a tiny cog in the colossal machinery of what was initially envisioned as a lightning-fast campaign, the famed Blitzkrieg. The propaganda posters, which you vaguely recall from another life, promised an easy victory. They depicted triumphant soldiers, clean and resolute, marching beneath a benevolent sun, perhaps with the cheeky, confident caption of "Schnapps in Moscow by Christmas." The reality, however, tastes not of schnapps, but of mud grit and an unsettling tang of defeat. Instead of swift advances and celebratory toasts, your days are defined by a far more intimate, far less glorious struggle. You find yourself elbow-deep in puddles not for any strategic reason, but because you've just slipped face first into an unmarked crater, the kind that seems to materialize out of nowhere, determined to swallow you whole. Now you're fumbling desperately trying to retrieve your dropped rifle, its cold metal slick with the same vile sludge that coats your face. It's a clumsy, undignified dance with the earth itself. The mud is not merely a terrain feature. It is an unforeseen adversary, a personal enemy with moods. It can be sly, pulling your boot off with a casual suction, or openly hostile, dissolving the very ground beneath you. The weather, too, is an unpredictable foe, shifting with a volatile capriciousness that mocks any notion of stable conditions. One moment the sky might be a bruised leaden gray, hinting at nothing more than a perpetual drizzle. The next, without warning, a full-blown blizzard descends, turning the world into a howling white void. The roads, which were once mere dust-choked tracks, transform into impassable bogs, then freeze solid into corrugated sheets of ice, then thaw again into treacherous quagmires. This isn't just a change in temperature. It's a constant, disorienting assault on the senses, a brutal reminder that you are utterly at the mercy of forces far greater than any military command. You have witnessed with a morbid fascination the impact of this liquid and frozen chaos on the very tools of your supposed dominance. You've seen mighty panzer tanks, the pride of the Wehrmacht, not merely get stuck, but truly drown in the mud. They sink slowly but inexorably, their powerful engines roaring in protest, until the sound becomes a gurgle, then a choke, then an agonizing silence. You recall vividly the sight of a panzer commander, a man whose stern countenance usually betrayed no emotion, sobbing openly as his magnificent machine sank axle-deep into a particularly hungry patch of earth. It was still running its tracks, spinning uselessly, a dying beast trapped by the indifferent earth, abandoning its crew to their own more pedestrian fate. The irony is not lost on you. The fastest, most advanced instruments of war rendered utterly useless by something as ancient and elemental as plain old dirt and water. There was no glory in this, only the chilling realization that for all your technological might, the very ground beneath you could bring your entire world to a halt, reducing grand strategy to the pathetic whimper of a stalled engine. The further you delve into this landscape, the more distant the memories of simple comforts become. Dry socks, for instance. You rack your brain trying to conjure the feeling of them, the subtle friction of crisp cotton against clean skin. But the sensation is so alien, it might as well be a forgotten dream. Warm coffee steaming in a mug held by hands that aren't perpetually numb with cold seems like a myth from a children's story. And silence, true unbroken silence, where the only sound is the gentle thrum of your own blood in your ears, feels like a luxury so profound it must belong to another dimension entirely. These aren't just missing amenities. They are ghost sensations, fragments of a past life that stubbornly refuse to solidify in your memory. Everything you realize with a weary resignation squishes. Your boots, of course, are a given, their sodden leather perpetually weeping water with every lift and fall of your foot. But the sensation doesn't stop there. Your gloves, stiff with frozen mud and trapped moisture, feel like damp rags wrapped around your fingers. Even the sensation of your own skin beneath layers of perpetually damp wool seems to have acquired a certain give or rubbery numbness that makes it hard to distinguish flesh from fabric. It's as if your very being has been infused with the pervasive wetness of the environment, blurring the lines between you and the bog. The constant dampness, combined with the unyielding cold and the absolute lack of hygiene, is a breeding ground for a host of unwelcome companions. Take trench foot, for example, a condition as poetic as it is excruciating. Your feet, confined in those waterlogged boots, have become pale, swollen, and strangely numb, yet simultaneously prone to searing bursts of pain. Adding insult to injury, a stubborn fungal infection has taken root, turning your skin to a macerated, peeling mess. The medics, bless their grimly humorous souls, have cheerfully dubbed this delightful combination local flavor. It's their way of acknowledging the inescapable misery, a small bleak jest in the face of widespread suffering, a reminder that while your body may be failing, at least it's doing so with a certain regional flair. There's an ongoing, distant historical debate you vaguely recall from overheard conversations among officers who still had the energy to converse about whether German high command truly grasped the full devastating impact of the Russian autumn on their meticulously planned advance. From your vantage point, with your feet sinking into another glacial puddle, the answer seems painfully unequivocally clear. No, they did not. They did not outrun the elements, and now you, the infantryman, are paying for their optimism. Your body, a living testament to the catastrophic misjudgment of men far removed from the cold, hard ground. The air, too, has a distinct quality that once experienced is impossible to forget. It's a pervasive, wrong smell. A complex and unsettling symphony of odors that drills into your sinuses. There's the damp, musty sweetness of wet straw mingling with the acrid bite of burning hay from some distant, unknown fire. The metallic tang of cordite gunpowder's ghost is ever present, a constant reminder of the violence that churns around you. And underneath it all, a deep, pervasive funk of unwashed men, a collective effluvium of sweat, fear, and weeks, perhaps even months, without the luxury of proper cleaning. It's a smell that forces a conscious effort to breathe only through your mouth to try and filter out the oppressive reality that assaults your nose. The very act of respiration becomes a choice, a desperate attempt to avoid the full sensory immersion in this grim existence. Even the natural world seems to conspire against you, or perhaps simply exists as an indifferent, silent witness to your suffering. The trees, birch pine, and the stark blackened stumps of those recently felled by shellfire loom like witnesses, their bare branches skeletal against the gray sky. They crowd the narrow, muddy roads, creating an oppressive tunnel of natural surveillance, almost as if they are actively herding you forward, their silent presence, a constant claustrophobic pressure. Each rustle of leaves, each creak of a branch is not just a sound. It's a potential threat, a signal that something unseen might be moving in the undergrowth. Auditory vigilance is a constant, exhausting demand. Your ears are never truly at rest, not even when you collapse onto the damp earth for a few hours of fitful sleep. Every rustle could be a fox, a rat, or far more menacingly a partisan moving through the brush. The quiet here is not peace. It is merely waiting. It's the taut, breathless silence that precedes a sudden ambush, the held breath before a burst of machine gun fire. This enforced hyper-awareness means that true relaxation, the kind that allows your mind to unspool and drift, is an impossible luxury. Every sound or lack thereof holds a potential unspoken horror. Your gear, you've come to realize with bitter clarity, is fundamentally inadequate. These uniforms, designed perhaps for parades, and the neat ordered squares of drill grounds, are a cruel joke in the face of frost and swamps. The wool is far too thin, offering precious little insulation against the biting cold. Your boots, once stiff and new, are now a hindrance, offering little protection against the bog and the freezing temperatures. And your overcoat, meant to offer some measure of warmth, is laughably short, leaving your legs exposed to the icy embrace of the wind and mud. It's as if the very clothing you wear is an extension of the elements, allowing them to seep directly into your bones. Survival then becomes an art of desperate improvisation. You see it everywhere, and you participate in it yourself. A stolen scarf, perhaps from a deserted farmhouse, becomes a cherished possession wrapped tightly around your face to shield against the wind. Gloves, painstakingly fashioned from the dismembered sleeves of a dead man's coat, become a grim testament to the lengths one will go for a scrap of warmth. Extra socks. Those rare and precious treasures are tucked into any available crevice. Inside your tunic, beneath your hat, anywhere that might offer a scant layer of additional insulation. Each scrap of fabric, each salvaged item, is a tiny victory against the encroaching cold. The desperate longing for simple comforts is palpable. You reflect, trade a last cigarette, that precious morale booster, for a single genuinely dry blanket. Not even a warm one, just dry. The thought of that simple, absorbent rectangle of wool is almost erotic in its appeal, a visceral craving for something that would shield you, however briefly, from the omnipresent damp. The cold itself is not a sudden, sharp pain. It is far more insidious. It doesn't bite. It seeps. It slides between layers of your inadequate clothing, finding every tiny gap, every exposed patch of skin. It then makes a home deep within your bones, a chilling, persistent ache that vibrates through your very marrow. You wake up often shivering harder than you were when you fell into an exhausted stupor, the cold having dug itself deeper into your flesh during your brief broken slumber. Lying there in the mud, your eyes wide open in the dark, you watch your own breath plume crystallinely in the frigid air, a tiny, fragile cloud of life in the overwhelming emptiness. The question forms unspoken in the back of your mind. Will I even be able to move by morning? It's a recurring fear, a silent dread that your body too will simply give up and become another frozen shape in the endless, indifferent landscape. Despite the brutal, soul-crushing conditions, despite the mud that seems to possess a malevolent will, despite the cold that promises to make a permanent home in your very marrow, the orders are relentless. There is always movement, always a command to press forward, to slog through terrain that quite simply laughs at wheels and mocks the concept of forward. It's a Sisyphean task, each step a Herculean effort against a landscape that seems determined to reclaim every inch of ground. The very notion of progress feels like a cruel jest, as if the land itself is playing a long, drawn-out game of attrition, mocking your attempts to conquer it. You are burdened physically and psychologically by all your possessions, which feel less like tools of survival and more like anchors dragging you down. Your rifle, a heavy cold extension of your arm, is constantly at the ready. Ammo pouches stiff with cold and mud chafe against your hips. You carry 3 days of food if you're lucky, a meager ration that barely staves off the gnawing hunger. And in your coat pocket, perhaps a single faded photograph of a face from another life, a face you sometimes struggle to clearly recall. Your water canteen, a necessary evil, holds water that quickly freezes solid, becoming a useless block of ice rather than a source of hydration. Every ounce of weight, every item you carry feels magnified by the relentless physical exertion required just to stay upright. Even here in the midst of this freezing, muddy hell, another more unexpected horror thrives: the mosquito. These tiny, buzzing tormentors, seemingly oblivious to the cold, appear in swarms thicker than smoke, a living, buzzing cloud that follows you relentlessly. They bite through fabric, through the thin wool of your uniform, leaving behind itchy, swollen welts. Your eyelids often are so inflamed and puffy from their bites that they ache with every blink, adding another layer of misery to the already unbearable conditions. It's a reminder that nature in all its forms is indifferent to your suffering, and simply continues its own relentless cycle even in the heart of a frozen war. The mud, that omnipresent, malevolent adversary, sometimes becomes truly lethal. There's a dark, bitter joke that circulates among the men, whispered with a grim sort of gallows humor: the mud has teeth. This macabre jest is validated by moments that sear themselves into your memory. You recall with a chilling clarity the sight of a horse, a powerful, sturdy beast sinking slowly, inexorably into a particularly viscous patch of earth. It struggled its powerful legs, churning, but the mud simply swallowed it whole without a trace, leaving only a disturbed ripple on the surface. Its rider, a man you didn't know, simply continued forward, his face expressionless, leaving his mount to its silent, undignified end. There was no time for mourning, no opportunity for rescue, only the cold, hard realization that the earth itself was capable of consuming even the strongest among you. The mantra of endurance, durchhalten, is a constant companion barked out by officers whose voices sound increasingly hollow and strained. It's not an order, it's a plea, a desperate incantation against the creeping despair. You repeat it to yourself silently with every agonizing step, but the words feel hollow, brittle, stripped of all meaning. The grim realization settles deep into your bones. Stopping means becoming a footnote. Another anonymous entry in a casualty report, if you're even lucky enough to get one. It means becoming a frozen shape in a ditch, a contorted icy sculpture in the indifferent landscape. It means becoming nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered around a meager, shivering fire by men who somehow impossibly made it through. And so the story begins in mud. It will end in snow. But every miserable second in between is a slow, agonizing drip of suffering, a relentless erosion of spirit and flesh. This is not the grand narrative of war, but the quiet, agonizing, personal one. And you know with a chilling certainty that this suffering, this unending misery, is only just beginning. The mud and the cold are merely the opening act. As the calendar pages tear away and the last vestiges of autumn's damp misery yield to the encroaching darkness, a new, even more profound form of suffering asserts itself. The cold you come to understand is not merely a drop in temperature. This is an ancient cold, a primordial force that seems to have existed before time itself, a glacial indifference capable of outlasting everyone and everything. It possesses a quality beyond mere temperature, a profound, almost spiritual chill that seeps into every crevice of existence. It's an insidious pain, one that goes beyond the stinging of exposed skin, beyond the ache of numbed fingers. This cold burrows deep under your uniform, under your layers of damp wool, under your very skin. It takes hold of your marrow, settling into the very core of your bones, a chilling embrace that refuses to leave. You try to clench your hands to make a fist, but your fingers feel like foreign objects, stiff and unresponsive. You question if they even exist, if the sensation you're feeling is truly yours, or just a phantom ache in a limb that has long since ceased to feel. The lack of sensation is almost as terrifying as the pain, a slow erasure of your own physical boundaries. This, you will later learn, is the infamous winter that broke. Not just men, but machines, and perhaps, most importantly, illusions. The winter of 1941 to 42. It was responsible for bringing everything to a grinding halt. Rifles, carefully maintained in the brief moments of rest, would simply refuse to fire their lubricants, congealed into useless goo. Their mechanisms frozen solid. Trucks, those vital arteries of supply, would sit like desolate hulks, their engines dead, their fuel lines choked with ice. And worst of all, lungs, human lungs, would simply stop working, succumbing to the brutal, relentless assault of the sub-zero air. Every breath became a gamble, a painful, rasping intake of air that felt like shattered glass in your chest. Your trench, a miserable, muddy ditch only weeks before, is now transformed. You wake to the sound of your boots cracking the frozen mud, a sharp, brittle sound that echoes in the pre-dawn quiet. The ground, once soft and yielding, is now hard and unforgiving. Its surface, sharper, more jagged from the thin crystalline frost that covers every inch. Even the very earth has become weaponized, its texture changing from a soft torment to a cruel, unyielding slab. Sleeping conditions, if one can even call them that, are a grim testament to the utter lack of comfort. You lie beneath a thin wool blanket, which offers about as much warmth as a damp handkerchief. You're bundled tightly like a sad burrito, trying to conserve every last scrap of body heat. Your breath, plumes of crystalline vapor, drifts slowly upwards in the frigid air, a visible manifestation of your struggle to simply remain alive. Each exhalation is a reminder of the vast, cold emptiness that surrounds you, a tiny, fleeting cloud of warmth, instantly swallowed by the indifferent chill. The irony is not lost on you. Your very survival is consuming your vital warmth, turning it into ephemeral mist. Survival in this landscape becomes a desperate, almost ritualistic struggle against the elements. Your canteen, which weeks ago barely contained water, is now a solid block of ice, a useless frozen lump of metal strapped to your side. Rations, when they arrive at all, are not the carefully prepared edible sustenance you once knew. Instead, they are blocks of meat and bread harder than your helmet, rigid and unyielding. The very act of eating transforms into a laborious, time-consuming ritual. You tuck a piece of bread or a sliver of frozen meat under your armpit, or sometimes even inside your trousers against your thigh, holding it there for hours, praying for some infinitesimal transfer of body heat that might render it chewable. Even then, it's a painful, jaw-aching endeavor, a testament to the sheer physical effort required to ingest a single calorie. Water, the most basic necessity, becomes a precious commodity, almost a miracle. The only way to procure it is to melt snow over a meager, carefully hidden fire. This itself is a precarious act, a desperate gamble against detection. The smallest wisp of smoke, The faintest flicker of light in the vast, dark emptiness could attract unwanted attention. A Soviet scout, a patrol, or worst of all, an artillery barrage that would obliterate you and your precious, slowly melting slush. Every sip is tinged with the bitter taste of fear and the ever-present threat of violence. There's a grim joke whispered with a hollow laugh among the men that perfectly encapsulates the brutal reality. Don't bother heating the soup, it'll freeze again before it reaches your mouth. And the tragic truth is, it often does. You might manage to warm a thin gruel, bring it to your lips, and feel it begin to crystallize almost instantly on your tongue, turning from a hopeful warmth to a cold, gritty disappointment. It's a reminder that even the simplest acts of comfort are snatched away by the relentless, all-encompassing cold. The machines, once the symbols of your technological superiority, suffer a similar agonizing paralysis. Panzer tanks, the pride of the Wehrmacht, sit like sleeping giants in the frozen landscape, their mighty engines silent, their steel hulls coated in hoarfrost. Their lubricants have congealed into thick, useless goo, and their battery acid has turned to slush. To prevent this, crews are forced into desperate fuel-guzzling measures, idling engines 24/7. But fuel is constantly low, a precious resource that dwindles with every passing hour, and the continuous rumble of the engines attracts unwanted attention, a beacon in the quiet, frozen night. Inevitably, despite their efforts, machines die, and when they do, the men exhausted and starving are left with the impossible task of pushing these 25-ton behemoths through hip-deep snow, a feat of physical exertion that even now you don't quite understand how you accomplished. Historians, you imagine, will later debate the decisions made by High Command, Hitler's refusal to adequately equip his troops with proper winter gear. Was it arrogance, a belief that the Blitzkrieg would render such provisions unnecessary? Or was it simply a catastrophic oversight, a profound underestimation of the Russian winter's brutal might? For the soldiers on the ground, however, such debates are irrelevant. You wear thin trousers, a flimsy tunic, and if you're lucky, a threadbare coat. Your boots, designed for the temperate plains of Europe, are sponge-like, absorbing every drop of moisture, freezing solid, and then thawing into an unbearable chafing torture. There is no warmth, no protection, only the constant, insidious bite of the cold. And in the darkest moments, a stark, painful desire sometimes surfaces, the envy of the dead. Their finality, their stillness, seems a mercy. To be free of the cold, to no longer feel its relentless burrowing into your bones, to simply cease to shiver, this, in the depths of winter's despair, is a tempting, almost desirable outcome, a quiet escape from the unending torment. It's a testament to the profound suffering that even death in its grim finality can appear as a form of comfort. Beyond the gnawing cold, there exists another constant, equally debilitating companion, the burden of hunger. Every step is an act of defiance against its relentless pull. Imagine carrying a machine gun, that weighty metallic beast, when you haven't eaten in 3 days. It feels heavier than a toddler, its cold steel pressing into your shoulder. Your arms, devoid of sustenance, feel like overcooked noodles, weak and trembling, barely capable of holding the weapon aloft. Every ounce of energy is meticulously rationed, carefully expended. Each step sinks an inch into the freshly fallen snow, and each pull forward, each lift of a heavy boot from the clinging white blanket, feels like dragging a sled piled high with bricks. Your muscles scream in protest, but there is no respite, no rest, only the relentless forward momentum of the column. To cope with the perpetual emptiness, you find yourself engaging in peculiar, almost absurd forms of psychological self-preservation. Your stomach cramps, those sharp, insistent pangs of hunger acquire names. You refer to them with a grim sort of familiarity as Heinrich and Otto, like old unwelcome friends who have taken up permanent residence in your gut. This small act of personification, this strange intimacy with your own suffering, is a way of acknowledging the pain without being completely overwhelmed by it. Food in this brutal landscape has become a myth, a whispered legend. Rumors circulate like precious currency tales of real sausages in the mythical rear supply depots, stories of warm, freshly baked bread. You hear of men who traded their last pair of serviceable boots for a single bite of something substantial. Men who would sell their very soul for the fleeting comfort of a hot potato. Your last truly memorable meal you vaguely recall was something that vaguely resembled soup concocted from powdered concentrate boiled water, and if you were lucky, one lonely solitary beet. And that was 3 days ago. The official reports, the ones read aloud by officers who still had a shred of optimism in their voices, declared that you were well equipped and well supplied on paper, that is. The reality on the ground was far different. Here in the frozen, desolate expanse, you were gnawing on tree bark, a bitter, fibrous substitute for proper sustenance. The logistical chain you bitterly reflect has ghosted the soldiers like a bad date that promises much and delivers nothing. The promised trucks, the vital deliveries of food and fuel, simply never materialize, leaving you to fend for yourself against the overwhelming indifference of the elements. When letters home are sent, those precious, infrequent connections to another life, you find yourself making impossible requests. Send socks, send salami, send. You know deep down that your mothers, safe in their warm homes, probably think you are exaggerating, that you're painting a dramatic picture. They couldn't possibly imagine the reality, the profound desperation that makes such simple items feel like the ultimate luxury, the difference between shivering misery and a fleeting moment of comfort. They can't fathom a world where salami is not merely food, but a symbol of warmth of home, of a life that feels impossibly distant. The suffering you observe with a detached, almost clinical eye extends beyond the human realm. Hundreds of thousands of horses, those sturdy beasts of burden, collapse in the snowbanks, their ribs starkly visible through their frozen hides, their eyes glazed over with a dull, vacant despair. They are an omnipresent reminder of the sheer unrelenting brutality of the conditions, their silent agony mirroring your own. You recall with a shudder the grim discovery of a supply team's mule half buried in the frost, frozen mid-chew, a final poignant image of its last desperate attempt at sustenance. It's a vision that haunts your periphery, a constant whisper of the fate that awaits anything or anyone that falters. One morning, out of grim necessity, you witness an officer cutting off a chunk of flank from a fallen horse, its flesh frozen hard. You watch, stomach churning but eyes fixed, as he hacks away, distributing pieces to the men. You learn to your surprise and a certain primal revulsion that horse meat, when cooked, tastes strangely sweet. It's a discovery you never wanted to make, a knowledge gained at a terrible price, cementing the reality of how far you have fallen from the familiar comforts of home. This isn't just about food. It's about the erosion of all the small, unstated boundaries that once defined a civilized existence. Survival then becomes an ingrained habit of hoarding calories. A crust of bread, dry and hard, is treated with the reverence of a sacred relic. A small lump of sugar scavenged from some forgotten supply wagon becomes gold, a precious treasure to be savored for as long as possible. You remember a fellow soldier, a quiet, unassuming man who had managed to acquire a piece of chocolate. He never ate it. Instead, he would take it out of his pocket, weakly, sniff it slowly, deeply, allowing the ghost of its scent to transport him, however briefly, to a place of comfort before carefully rewrapping it and putting it away. It's a bizarre, almost meditative ritual, a form of psychological coping that no one argued with. In this environment, any small act that offered a flicker of hope, however illogical, was not to be questioned. Historians, you realize, will spend decades debating the German supply system. Did it truly collapse, or was it simply never designed for the monstrous scale and brutal conditions of the Eastern Front? From your vantage point, the distinction is irrelevant. The result is the same. Trucks stuck every 5 minutes, their wheels spinning uselessly in the mud or bogged down in snow. Fuel freezing solid in the lines, rendering vehicles immobile. Roads vanishing entirely under blankets of fresh snow, or transformed into impassable bogs, often mined by partisan saboteurs. The entire logistical backbone which was supposed to sustain this vast invasion was crumbling, leaving you isolated and vulnerable. There's a constant chilling sensation of being slowly digested by a land that never wanted you here. It's an active, almost predatory landscape that relentlessly works to break you down, absorbing your efforts, your energy, your very will. To cope, some men develop a peculiar endearing quirk of naming the supply trucks that against all odds occasionally make it through. They call them Gretel or the Widow, personifying these rare, precious conveyances. You find yourself cheering their muddy, slow arrivals with a genuine surge of relief and mourning their disappearances, lost to mud, to partisans, to engine failure with a quiet, profound sadness. For these trucks are not merely vehicles. They represent hope, movement, connection to a world that seems increasingly distant and unreal. They are a fragile thread to sanity in an otherwise insane existence. And then there is sweet, glorious dysentery. The irony of those words is a bitter, almost unbearable taste in your mouth. This disease, a constant companion on the front, is often referred to as morale shattering, and for good reason. You recognize its onset by the frantic, haunted looks in your comrades' eyes, the desperate, hunched-over runs behind the nearest tree line, sometimes not even making it that far. It strips you of dignity, of strength, and of any semblance of control over your own body. The constant debilitating evacuations leave you weak, dehydrated, and utterly miserable, turning every movement into an exhausting ordeal. Sanitation in this environment is a cruel joke. You pray with a fervent desperation you once reserved for more profound matters, for non-poisonous leaves to wipe yourself with, or for enough fresh snow for some semblance of hygiene. But often, neither is available, leaving you to endure the raw, chafed agony that comes with the disease. You've seen it firsthand. One man, utterly depleted by the relentless onslaught, simply sat down behind a tree, too weak to move, and never stood up again. His death was not glorious, not dramatic. It was a quiet, ignominious surrender to a disease that chewed away at him from the inside. The water, even the melted snow that you so meticulously collect, carries a distinct unsettling smell, like regret. You know intellectually that it's likely contaminated, teeming with unseen pathogens. When possible, you boil it over a meager fire, hoping the heat will sterilize its invisible dangers. But often, there's no time, no fuel, no opportunity. In those moments, you hold your breath, you close your eyes, and you simply hope. Hope that this time your weakened body can withstand the next assault. Hope that you won't be the next one to succumb to the relentless churn in your gut. Your stomach, ravaged by hunger and infection, becomes an orchestra of protesting, gurgling sounds, a cacophony that would genuinely frighten wild animals. It churns, it rumbles, it groans with a life of its own, independent of your will. This you and your comrades grimly joke is the Eastern Front Stomach Orchestra, a truly unique and deeply unpleasant musical ensemble that provides the constant involuntary soundtrack to your daily misery. It's a dark humor born of desperation, a way to laugh at the very things that are slowly, inexorably killing you. The psychological and physical toll of this existence is profound and all-encompassing. The constant vigilance, that hyper-awareness you developed in the mud, never truly abates. Your ears are perpetually strained, never relaxing even in the shallow, broken sleep you snatch. This quiet is not peaceful. It is merely waiting. Waiting for the distant rumble of artillery, for the sudden crack of a sniper's rifle, for the rustle of a partisan patrol. True silence, the kind that lets your mind wander and rest, is a forgotten luxury. The cold, that insidious enemy, has by now seeped deep into your bones, a constant low-grade ache that permeates every cell. It has moved beyond the surface, burrowing into your very marrow, making a permanent home in your skeletal structure. The numbness, initially confined to your fingers and toes, has begun to spread a slow creep throughout your body. You find it increasingly difficult to distinguish between the sensation of your skin and the fabric of your clothing. The lines are blurring your body, becoming less your own, more a part of the cold, unyielding landscape. This physical numbness you observe with a growing sense of detachment begins to extend inward, subtly, insidiously touching your emotions, dulling your responses, turning fear and despair into a kind of hollow emptiness. The numbness you find isn't just physical. It seeps into your very perception, altering what you recall as normal. What did dry socks feel like? That crisp, satisfying crackle of fabric, the immediate warmth against your skin. The memory is fading, replaced by the constant clammy embrace of perpetual dampness. Warm coffee, a forgotten aroma, a phantom heat on your tongue. And true silence, the kind that lets your own thoughts rise and fall like gentle waves, is entirely alien. The mind, you realize, is a strange and adaptable thing, quickly making space for the immediate, the pressing, and discarding the unnecessary luxuries of a previous life. Instead of silence, you live with a new kind of white noise. It's a constant low thrum composed of the relentless wind whipping across the vast plains, the whispering shh of snowflakes driven horizontally by the biting gusts, and the harsh hissing sound of your own breath as it crystallizes and vanishes. This incessant symphony of the elements, punctuated by the distant muffled thud of artillery or the rattle of machine guns, creates a unique kind of soundscape. War here isn't always the roaring, chaotic thunder you might imagine from a safe distance. Here it often manifests as a pervasive, almost meditative whisper, a constant reminder of its presence without the dramatic crescendos. And within this constant whisper, you learn to identify the absence of sound, the unnatural stillness that often precedes a barrage or an ambush. This listening to absences becomes a survival instinct, a sixth sense honed by fear and necessity. In this world where official gear proved laughably insufficient, survival demanded ingenuity. You, along with every other soldier, became a master of improvisation. Take, for instance, the curious fashion statement of newspaper insulation. You'd scrounge for any discarded newspaper, its pages fragile and brittle in the cold, and meticulously wrap your legs in them. Yes, the official communiques, the stirring declarations of victory, the reports of valiant advances, all became a desperate, if flimsy, layer between your skin and the insidious cold. Sometimes a comrade would even tape sheets of the Volkischer Beobachter or other official papers to his shins, perhaps with a grim, sarcastic chuckle about cultural armor. You might scoff, but you wouldn't argue. Even Goethe poems printed on brittle newsprint became a potential, if ironic, insulator against freezing to death. The absurdity of wrapping grand verses around your calves hoping to stave off hypothermia isn't lost on you. It's bleak humor, a small, defiant gesture against the overwhelming bleakness. Beyond the printed word, you learned to listen to the land itself, a different kind of wisdom entirely. You learned to discern the unnatural stillness, the sudden absence of birdsong, the unusual quiet among the rustling branches. These weren't just random occurrences. They were signals, subtle warnings that spoke of danger, a hidden sniper, an approaching patrol, or a partisan ambush. Your ears, perpetually strained, became finely tuned instruments picking up on the minute shifts in the environment that might mean the difference between life and death. You learned that the wind in its whisper could carry more than just snow. It could carry the faint scent of wood smoke from an unseen camp or the metallic tang of distant exhaust. The concept of layering clothing, a simple fashion advice in a modern, comfortable world, becomes a desperate art form. Scarves, rags, even sections cut from sandbags are meticulously wrapped and tied around your body. You stuff them into your boots, around your neck, under your tunic. Anything that offers an extra, however meager, barrier against the cold. The thought of wearing a dead soldier's discarded coat, or even parts of it, crosses your mind, or perhaps you've already seen others do it. It's a grim calculus of survival where sentimentality quickly freezes and shatters. You become acutely aware of the weight of each layer, the drag of the fabric, but the alternative is far worse. Your body, once a source of comfort and strength, is now a vulnerable vessel demanding constant, desperate intervention just to maintain a fragile equilibrium against the overwhelming chill. The mundane task of securing potable water, once an afterthought, becomes a life-or-death gamble. You boil contaminated water whenever possible, watching the wisps of steam rise like ephemeral prayers into the frigid air. The bubbling of the water, a rare sign of heat, is a comforting sound, but the knowledge of what it once contained, what invisible dangers it still might hold, never quite leaves you. When boiling is not an option, you simply hold your breath, grimace, and hope for the best, pouring the lukewarm, perhaps still tainted liquid down your throat, trusting to sheer luck and a battered immune system. It's a moment of profound vulnerability, an acknowledgement of the fragile line between survival and succumbing to an unseen enemy. Sleep in this realm of perpetual discomfort ceases to be a restorative act and transforms into another form of tactical adaptation. You learn to dig sideways in the trenches, creating small, cramped hollows that offer a meager shelter from the wind and the enemy's sight. Often you sleep sitting up, hunched over your rifle, your helmet pulled low, snatching brief, broken moments of unconsciousness. Your mind, through sheer necessity, learns not to dream, or at least not to dream of the familiar comforts of home. Instead, your nightmares are populated by menacing forests, by the chilling whispers of the wind, by the sudden crack of ice underfoot. The only dreams that consistently pierce through are those of basic sustenance, the tantalizing aroma of hot coffee, the solid weight of a loaf of fresh bread, the sound of a crackling fire. You often wake up biting at your blanket, the phantom taste of food a cruel echo in your empty mouth. Movement itself changes, evolving from a simple act of progression to a complex instinctual dance with the hostile environment. You learn to stop walking on the established paths, which are often mined or under observation. Instead, you begin bushwhacking through hip-deep snow, moving silently through the forests, your body becoming a part of the white, trackless landscape. You learn to read the forest itself, to interpret the subtle signs of danger. A broken branch, an unnatural stillness in the bird, calls a faint scent of wood smoke that tells you an enemy is near. The trees, once silent witnesses, become your reluctant allies, offering cover and concealment, demanding constant interpretation. The stark reality of the Soviet enemy's superior winter gear quickly becomes apparent, stripping away any lingering illusions of German preparedness. You see the quilted jackets, the warm felt boots, the fur-lined hats worn by the Soviet soldiers, and a profound desperate envy takes root. You realize with a chilling clarity that their gear is simply better suited to this brutal environment. And so the practical demands of survival override any sense of ideological purity. You begin collecting Soviet gear, stripping it from the fallen, discarding your own useless sponge-like boots for their sturdy, warm felt ones, swapping your thin, inadequate coat for their thick, padded tunics. It's a quiet, personal acknowledgement of defeat on a fundamental level. A silent admission that the enemy is simply better adapted to this monstrous landscape. The wetness, however, is a continuous, pervasive torment, a baseline of misery from which there is no escape. Whether it's the autumn mud or the winter thaw, rain seems to fall indoors through half-gone roofs, dripping relentlessly onto your rifle, onto your face, onto your few meager possessions. Your helmet and coat, once meant to shed water, now seem to absorb it, becoming heavy, sodden sponges. You feel wet even when you're not moving, a profound internal dampness that seeps into your bones. Your clothing begins to mold a faint, musty scent that adds to the pervasive wrong smell of the front. And in the trenches, those pitiful half-dug ditches, water is a constant presence. You spend precious energy bailing it out with cups, with your helmet, with your bare hands. But it's a futile effort, a perpetual battle against the encroaching damp. Your boots, once a symbol of your military bearing, deteriorate into a biohazard. They are so rotten, so waterlogged, that you have to wrap them in wire to hold them together, their leather splitting, their soles flapping loose. Your skin, perpetually wet and cold, takes on a ghastly, boiled meat color, a testament to the persistent fungal infections and trench foot that have turned your feet into a raw, macerated mess. And your rifle, the very tool of your trade, suffers from the pervasive filth. Mud, water, and grime gum up its intricate parts, causing it to jam frequently to misfire. Inevitably, you find yourself carrying a sharpened stick or a heavy club for close combat, a grim regression to a more primitive form of warfare, a silent admission that your sophisticated weaponry is failing you against the elemental brutality of the Eastern Front. Now, having glimpsed the elemental enemies, the mud, the cold, the hunger, it's time to briefly turn our attention to the human component of this brutal equation. For all the misery inflicted by the land, the core of the experience remained the relentless, often unseen grind of combat. Your entry into this meat grinder was in 1941, a faceless part of Army Group Center, one of the three colossal prongs of Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. The sheer scale of it, when you briefly consider it in moments of detached reflection, is staggering. Over 3 million German soldiers, backed by hundreds of thousands of vehicles from staff cars to panzer tanks, and supported by a staggering 750,000 horses, were funneled east. This wasn't just an army. It was a migration, a tidal wave of steel and flesh crashing against the vastness of the Soviet Union. Initially, there was a sense of almost exhilarating, if terrifying, success. The early days of the advance were marked by a dizzying speed that seemed to confirm every boast of blitzkrieg. Soviet lines, caught unprepared, crumbled with shocking rapidity. Cities, once distant names on maps, fell in quick succession, their names announced by weary but still proud officers. There was a genuine, if fleeting, sense of winning, a belief that the predictions of a swift victory might actually come to pass. You saw the prisoners, endless columns of them, their faces bewildered, their numbers beyond counting. You heard the distant triumphant roar of Stukas overhead, the steady rhythmic thump-thump-thump of artillery that seemed to pave your way forward. It almost felt for a brief deceptive period like a proper war with clear objectives and discernible progress. But then, almost imperceptibly at first, the dynamics began to shift. The gears which had once spun with such effortless speed began to grind. The rapid advance slowed, then stuttered, then stalled. The victories felt less definitive, the enemy's resistance more stubborn. The very landscape seemed to expand, stretching your lines thin, making every kilometer gained feel like a desperate struggle. It wasn't a sudden halt, more a gradual agonizing deceleration, like a heavy train struggling up an endless incline, its engine straining its momentum slowly bleeding away. The initial exhilaration curdled into something far more grim and exhausting. As a soldier on the ground, your perspective was necessarily limited, brutally confined to your immediate reality. You were not a general poring over maps in a warm, dry tent, charting grand pincer movements and strategic encirclements from 5,000 feet up. No, you felt the maps with your blistered, bleeding feet. The only pincer movement you truly understood was the one of your perpetually wet boots trying to extricate themselves from the clinging mud. You were utterly unaware of the larger strategic picture of the grand designs being drawn by men far removed from the cold, hard earth. All you knew, all you felt, was the constant, relentless forward shove of physical and mental pressure to keep moving, to keep pushing deeper into a relentless Soviet formation that, despite all the initial successes, refused to truly break. The initial feeling of triumph was slowly, insidiously replaced by a profound sense of an unchanging, unending pressure. The enemy, while initially disoriented, began to coalesce, to resist, to push back with a stubbornness that defied conventional military logic. You were no longer just advancing. You were constantly pushing against a resilient, seemingly limitless wall of opposition. This fundamental shift from easy victory to grinding attrition began to rewrite the very definition of this war, transforming it from a swift conquest into a slow, agonizing process of mutual destruction. The early confidence evaporated like breath in the freezing air, replaced by a quiet, pervasive dread. Then came the chilling observation from Dieter, a quiet, observant fellow who rarely spoke unless it was truly important. His words, delivered in a low, hollow tone, became a whispered truth among the men. The Soviets, he noted, were inhuman. Not in the sense of being monstrous, but in their capacity for endurance, their utterly baffling indifference to losses. You saw it for yourself. Wave after wave of Russian soldiers, seemingly endless, would take devastating casualties, entire lines mown down by machine gun fire, and still they would continue to charge. Even tanks, their hulls peppered with the futile impacts of small arms fire, would advance relentlessly. Soviet soldiers riding on their turrets lobbing grenades with a suicidal disregard for their own safety. It defied every military doctrine, every expectation of self-preservation you had been taught. It was unnerving, profoundly unsettling. This seemingly irrational tenacity, however, concealed a terrifyingly swift capacity for learning and adaptation. By October, the initial disarray of the Soviet forces began to solidify into something far more dangerous. They weren't just throwing bodies into the meat grinder, they were fighting smart. They learned to stretch your already thin German lines, drawing you deeper into their vast, desolate territory. Then, when your trucks ran out of fuel, when your soldiers ran out of food, when your lines were stretched to the breaking point, They would slam into you with sudden devastating artillery barrages, with tank assaults that seemed to materialize from nowhere, catching you unprepared and vulnerable. Their own losses, while horrific, seemed to be part of a larger, more brutal calculation, a willingness to sacrifice for strategic advantage. Russia itself, you slowly realized, possessed a weapon far more formidable than any tank or artillery piece its own vastness. The sheer incomprehensible scale of Russian space allowed you to penetrate deeper and deeper, to advance hundreds of kilometers, only to find yourselves swallowed by an endless, indifferent landscape. This immense space, this seemingly empty canvas, was not vacant. It became an active, malevolent enemy. Trees, ancient and gnarled, would fall in suspicious patterns, blocking your progress. Hidden mines, artfully concealed in the mud of old wheel ruts, would detonate beneath your unwary feet. Entire columns, once neat and disciplined, would simply vanish into the murky depths of the forests, swallowed by the silence, leaving behind only rumors and a pervasive sense of dread. The land itself was fighting you slowly but surely, turning every kilometer gained into a deeper entrapment. The German term, Kesselschlacht, or cauldron battle, was thrown around by officers in the early days, a clinical description of brilliant encirclement tactics. But on the Eastern Front, it acquired a grim, terrifying new meaning. You understood with a sickening clarity the grim reality of being surrounded, cut off from your comrades, encircled by an invisible, tightening noose. You were not encircling the enemy. You were being cooked by their brutal attritional tactics, slowly, agonizingly boiled alive in the vast hostile cauldron of the Russian landscape. The hunters, you realized, had become the hunted. Despite this undeniable grinding reality, high command, or at least your immediate officers, seemed locked in a profound state of denial. They still spoke of winning, of strategic withdrawals, and regrettable but necessary repositioning. But you, the soldier, knew the truth. You understood these euphemisms for what they truly were: running. The relentless, exhausting act of running, of retreating, of simply trying to survive another day. You watched with a quiet despair as the once endless columns of trucks, of guns, and most terrifyingly of men visibly shrunk with each passing day. The focus, once on promotion, on heroism, on the distant glory of victory, had irrevocably shifted. Now the only goal, the only aspiration, was mere survival. Everything else had faded into irrelevance, replaced by the stark, brutal calculus of simply staying alive in a world determined to consume you. In the face of such overwhelming brutality and the constant psychological assault, the human mind, in its peculiar resilience, seeks out small anchors of sanity, moments of defiance, or strange, often illogical coping mechanisms. You might find yourself pocketing a single chicken feather, a vibrant, unexpected splash of color against the gray-brown monotony. It's a small, quiet act, a reminder of life, of something soft and delicate, a stark contrast to the omnipresent grimness. It serves as a tangible, almost absurd connection to a world that feels impossibly far away. Or perhaps you might hear a comrade lying with a straight face about receiving a letter from home. A letter filled with cheer and good news, even though you both know the supply lines are utterly broken. But you don't call him out. Instead, you listen, allowing his desperate fiction to weave a temporary warmth through the chilled air, a shared illusion that for a brief moment makes the cold slightly less biting, the hunger a little less sharp. These are the small shared acts of humanity born of desperation, but fostering a fragile, vital connection. The true nature of war, you realize, is not what the propaganda machine back home depicts. It is not always loud, fast, or glamorous. Here on the Eastern Front, war is slow. It drags like your heavy, mud-caked boots. It oozes like the black clinging sludge that seems to swallow everything. It waits with a predatory patience for you to falter, to make a mistake, to simply give up. This brutal, drawn-out reality stands in stark contrast to the heroic, swift narratives painted for those safe at home who still imagine conflict as a series of dramatic, decisive clashes. Here, war is a dull, grinding attrition, a constant state of exhaustion. And the dreams, oh, the dreams. They are vivid, agonizingly real, and singularly focused. You dream constantly of food, hot steaming bread slabs of meat, perhaps even a forgotten apple. The sensations are so powerful that you wake up with a jolt, your mouth watering only to find yourself biting at your blanket, the harsh wool a bitter disappointment against the phantom taste of sustenance. These dreams are a cruel torment, a reminder of your deprivation, but also a testament to the mind's desperate need for nourishment, even if only in the realm of sleep. The lines between enemy and self begin to blur, dissolving under the immense pressure of survival. You find yourself with a curious detachment copying Soviet tactics, adopting their movements, their ways of camouflaging themselves against the snow-covered landscape. You even find yourself wearing stolen warmer Soviet gear, their thick quilted jackets, their felt boots, their fur-lined hats. It's a pragmatic choice, devoid of ideology, a silent acknowledgement that their equipment is simply better suited to this environment, a more effective shield against the crushing cold. The uniform, the symbol of identity, becomes secondary to the raw biological imperative to survive. You feel yourself changing, hardening, becoming a different person entirely. You no longer ask questions, not rhetorical ones, not even silent ones. You simply eat faster if there's food swallowing without savoring. You march faster, driven by an instinct for self-preservation, propelled by a primal need to keep moving to escape the creeping death that seems to follow every stationary moment. And most importantly, you trust no one, not entirely. Not the officers, not the distant high command, not even at times your own exhausted judgment. This hardening is a necessary shield, a protective shell against the onslaught of inhumanity. The silence, initially unnerving, begins to grow. Words become a luxury communication reduced to grunts, nods, and gestures. The act of speaking, of forming complex thoughts, seems like an unnecessary exertion, a drain on precious energy. The silence grows enveloping you, becoming a new, unsettling normal. The most terrifying loss you begin to realize isn't necessarily life itself. It's the insidious, creeping erosion of your own identity. The fear not of dying, but of disappearing. Of becoming just a shape, a shadow, a body moving west, indistinguishable from the thousands of others trudging through the snow and mud. You find yourself fighting desperately against this erasure, against the feeling that you are slowly being rendered anonymous by the overwhelming scale of the suffering. The memories, those precious anchors to a previous life, begin to fray and unravel. You struggle to recall simple things. The exact date of your sister's birthday, the precise lilt of your father's voice, the texture of his old wool coat. Names and faces once so vivid become hazy, indistinct. Your brain, it seems, is making space a cruel but necessary act of triage for the immediate overwhelming demands of survival. It discards the softer, more comforting details of home to accommodate the ceaseless biting cold, the gnawing hunger, the constant threat of death. You look into the sunken eyes and unreadable expressions of your comrades, and you see your own deterioration reflected back at you, a shared mirror of a fading humanity. You look in a cracked, salvaged mirror, perhaps a shard found in a bombed-out house, and you see a stranger staring back. Not the young man who left home full of youthful hope or naive bravado. No, this is someone else, half shadow, half soldier, a gaunt, hollow-eyed figure whose face is etched with lines of perpetual exhaustion and unspoken horror. The person you once were is slowly losing the shape of yourself, a disquieting transformation that leaves you feeling profoundly alienated from your own reflection. Your rifle, once a symbol of duty and power, now feels less like a tool and more like an unbearable burden. It has warped its wooden stock, perhaps splintered its metallic parts, perpetually jammed with mud and ice. Yet, strangely, not carrying it would feel worse. To be without it would be to lose the last sliver of control, the final thread connecting you to a semblance of military purpose. It is a heavy, almost useless extension of your arm, but you cling to it, a desperate, almost superstitious act of self-preservation. After a skirmish, after the chaotic, terrifying burst of violence subsides, you expect to feel something: relief, fear, anger. But increasingly, you feel nothing. Just a profound, almost absolute numbness. The adrenaline drains away, leaving behind an emptiness, a quiet void where emotion once resided. It's a terrifying absence, a further erosion of your humanity, a sign that the constant exposure to atrocity has finally begun to dull your capacity to feel. One chilling memory: hearing your own name shouted by an unseen enemy voice during a brief, brutal exchange of fire. The shock of it, the sudden visceral realization that someone out there, someone you'd never seen, knew your name and wanted you gone. It wasn't just a faceless enemy, but someone who for a moment recognized your individuality, only to wish for its annihilation. This brief, terrifying personal connection underscored the brutal intimacy of this distant war, reminding you that even amidst the vastness, you were still a target, still an individual to be extinguished. It was a profound and unsettling moment, breaking through the protective layers of numbness with a sudden sharp clarity. Amidst the chaos and desolation, the human spirit stubbornly and often irrationally clings to small, peculiar quirks, superstitions, and defiant acts of sanity. You might find yourself pocketing a single chicken feather, a vibrant, unexpected splash of color against the gray-brown monotony. It's a small, quiet act, a reminder of life, of something soft and delicate, a stark contrast to the omnipresent grimness. It serves as a tangible, almost absurd connection to a world that feels impossibly far away. Or perhaps you might hear a comrade lying with a straight face about receiving a letter from home, a letter filled with cheer and good news, even though you both know the supply lines are utterly broken. But you don't call him out. Instead, you listen, allowing his desperate fiction to weave a temporary warmth through the chilled air, a shared illusion that for a brief moment makes the cold slightly less biting, the hunger a little less sharp. These are the small shared acts of humanity born of desperation, but fostering a fragile, vital connection. The true nature of war, you realize, is not what the propaganda machine back home depicts. It is not always loud, fast, or glamorous. Here on the Eastern Front, war is slow. It drags like your heavy, mud-caked boots. It oozes like the black, clinging sludge that seems to swallow everything. It waits with a predatory patience for you to falter, to make a mistake, to simply give up. This brutal, drawn-out reality stands in stark contrast to the heroic, swift narratives painted for those safe at home who still imagine conflict as a series of dramatic, decisive clashes. Here, war is a dull, grinding attrition, a constant state of exhaustion. And the dreams, oh, the dreams. They are vivid, agonizingly real, and singularly focused. You dream constantly of food, hot steaming bread slabs of meat, perhaps even a forgotten apple. The sensations are so powerful that you wake up with a jolt, your mouth watering only to find yourself biting at your blanket, the harsh wool a bitter disappointment against the phantom taste of sustenance. These dreams are a cruel torment, a reminder of your deprivation, but also a testament to the mind's desperate need for nourishment, even if only in the realm of sleep. The lines between enemy and self begin to blur, dissolving under the immense pressure of survival. You find yourself with a curious detachment copying Soviet tactics, adopting their movements, their ways of camouflaging themselves against the snow-covered landscape. You even find yourself wearing stolen warmer Soviet gear, their thick quilted jackets, their felt boots, their fur-lined hats. It's a pragmatic choice devoid of ideology, a silent acknowledgement that their equipment is simply better suited to this environment, a more effective shield against the crushing cold. The uniform, the symbol of identity, becomes secondary to the raw biological imperative to survive. You feel yourself changing, hardening, becoming a different person entirely. You no longer ask questions, not rhetorical ones, not even silent ones. You simply eat faster if there's food swallowing without savoring. You march faster driven by an instinct for self-preservation, propelled by a primal need to keep moving to escape the creeping death that seems to follow every stationary moment. And most importantly, you trust no one, not entirely. Not the officers, not the distant high command, not even at times your own exhausted judgment. This hardening is a necessary shield, a protective shell against the onslaught of inhumanity. The silence, initially unnerving, begins to grow. Words become a luxury communication reduced to grunts, nods, and gestures. The act of speaking, of forming complex thoughts, seems like an unnecessary exertion, a drain on precious energy. The silence grows enveloping you, becoming a new, unsettling normal. Sometimes when the silence stretched too long, broken only by the incessant wind or the distant muffled thump of unseen artillery, a soldier would begin to hum. Not a specific tune, not a recognizable folk song or marching anthem, but a low, nameless melody, a wordless drone that filled the oppressive void. It wasn't an act of entertainment. It was a quiet, almost unconscious confirmation of being alive, a small vibration against the vast empty canvas of the frozen landscape. The hum would often be picked up by another, then another, until a quiet, shared drone resonated through the trenches, a soft, communal murmur of existence, a lullaby of the living in a land of the dead. It was a sound that paradoxically brought a strange comfort, a sense of quiet solidarity in the face of absolute despair. You recall a particularly haunted-looking man, his eyes wide and vacant, who had begun building a small, crude shrine in the corner of his dugout. It was constructed entirely from spent rifle cartridges meticulously stacked and arranged into a miniature pyramid. He would spend hours staring at it, occasionally adding another empty casing to the growing collection. He wasn't praying, not in any conventional sense. He was, it seemed, seeking something to believe in, something tangible to anchor his shattered reality, a mute testament to the countless rounds fired, the lives taken, and the simple, brutal fact of his own survival. Each casing represented a moment, a breath, a fleeting instant of action, perhaps a desperate plea for meaning in the meaningless. Then there was the soldier who, amidst the rubble of a bombed-out village, stumbled upon a single vibrant blue ribbon miraculously untarnished. Without explanation, he tied it to the barrel of his rifle. He called it his guardian, and for a time he seemed genuinely convinced it afforded him a measure of protection. This small personal totem, this bright, hopeful splash of color against the grim backdrop of war, sparked a curious trend. Other men, seeing his unwavering conviction, began to search for their own small charms. A piece of bone, a rusted coin, a fragment of glass tying them to their rifles, their helmets, or their belts. It was a quiet, almost childlike faith in the power of ordinary objects to ward off the extraordinary horrors that surrounded them. A young, gaunt soldier in your company found a tin whistle in a deserted house. He couldn't play it well. The notes were off-key, reedy, and often cracked, but he would play anyway in the lulls between shelling thin, mournful tunes that drifted across the snow. The sound, far from being pleasant, became a lament of the lost lung, a mournful, wheezing echo of the pervasive sickness and suffering that plagued the ranks. Yet no one told him to stop. His simple, flawed melodies became another strange auditory anchor, a fragile thread of human expression in a world determined to silence it. You even observed men drawing imaginary maps in the dirt with sticks. Not maps of the front or of enemy positions, but maps of places that didn't exist, places called Better Place or Last Stop. They would trace imaginary roads, describe non-existent villages, creating a mental landscape, making somewhere to go, in a reality where the only direction was deeper into the vast, hostile East. It was a poignant, desperate act of creation, building a refuge in the mind when no physical refuge existed. Superstitions, too, began to crystallize quiet, illogical beliefs born of sheer desperation. You might find yourself timing your blinks with the impacts of distant shells, a personal ritual, a silent, irrational belief that if you didn't blink, the shell wouldn't hit you, or at least wouldn't hit you directly. You'd notice a comrade consciously avoiding certain wrong trees, or making a wide detour around a cursed road where too many men had fallen. Turning around if you accidentally stepped in the same puddle twice became a small, unexplained fear, an absurd ritual to ward off ill fortune. A sparrow landing on a rifle barrel was for some a clear sign that the soldier was untouchable, an omen of miraculous immunity. And strangely, many adopted a small shared fear of stepping on clear ice, a peculiar aversion to something that looked solid but could be treacherously thin. All of these were small, irrational acts of control, a whispering to the wind, anything to keep going, to find a sliver of agency in a world that had stripped you of all power. Beyond the tangible enemies of mud, cold, and hunger, there existed another far more elusive threat, the land itself and the shadows that moved within it. The Soviets, you quickly learned, knew their land like a butcher knows bone. They understood its contours, its hidden paths, its treacherous bogs, and its unforgiving winters with an intimacy that was terrifyingly effective. This wasn't just geography. It was a profound, almost spiritual connection, allowing them to use the very earth as a weapon against you. They would let the weather, their silent, relentless ally, do much of the killing, allowing the frostbite, the dysentery, and the sheer exhaustion to take their toll before they even engaged in direct combat. The environment you discovered was rife with traps, some natural, some man-made, all equally deadly. Trees, seemingly ancient and harmless, would suddenly fall in suspicious patterns, deliberately felled to block your meager supply roads or to funnel your columns into predetermined killing zones. Mines expertly hidden in the ubiquitous mud of old wheel ruts or beneath a fresh dusting of snow lay waiting for an unwary foot or the heavy tread of a truck. Entire columns, once proud and disciplined, would simply vanish into the murky depths of the forests, swallowed by the silence, leaving behind only rumors and a pervasive sense of dread. The land was not a neutral stage for conflict. It was an active, malevolent participant working relentlessly against your every advance. There was a constant chilling sensation, a pervasive dread that the land was slowly digesting you, absorbing your efforts, your men, your very spirit. It never wanted you here, and it was patiently, systematically working to expel you, to consume you. The mud, that omnipresent antagonist, seemed to possess a genuine sentience. It would laugh at your futile struggles, spitting out logs just as you tried to gain purchase, pulling at your boots with a suction that feels personal, as if it delighted in hindering your every step. And then there was General Winter. This wasn't a myth, a romanticized notion for fireside tales. It was a force. Uncaring, relentless, a power older than empires and far more thorough in its destruction. It did not negotiate, it did not falter, and it killed with an absolute unyielding efficiency. You understood the Russian term Rasputitsa, the time of bad roads, not as a mere meteorological condition, but as a curse that killed with its weight, crushing your morale and erasing every ounce of your effort. It was a time when movement became agony, when supplies became impossible, and when hope began to freeze and crack like thin ice. In the darkest moments, you began to suspect that the Soviets didn't even need to catch you. The land itself, with its endless snow, its gnawing hunger, and its oppressive silence, would do their work for them. The woods, you felt with a chilling certainty, remembered every transgression, and they did not forgive. Adding to this pervasive natural threat were the partisans, those elusive shadows with rifles. Rumors would ripple through the lines like a cold draft, convoys vanishing without a trace, bridges collapsing just moments after your comrades had crossed rail lines, mysteriously torn up, disrupting vital supply routes. These weren't soldiers in the usual sense, not in neat uniforms with clear objectives. They were ghosts with rifles, farmers one day blending seamlessly into the local population, and then without warning assassins the next, striking with brutal precision before melting back into the landscape. Historians, you imagine, will later argue over the actual numbers, debating whether the partisan activity was as widespread and effective as the pervasive paranoia suggested. But for the soldier on the ground, the distinction was meaningless. Your finger rested tighter on the trigger whenever you approached a forest, your nerves stretched thin by the constant vigilance. You flinched at every rustle in the branches, every sudden movement in the periphery of your vision. It was a constant, exhausting state of alert, a war fought against an enemy you could rarely see, rarely engage, but always felt. Their tactics were brutal, hitting fast and hard, then vanishing into the snow, leaving behind only smoke, the chilling echo of distant ski sounds, and a profound sense of unease. The partisans fought with a brutality that defied conventional warfare, employing tactics that felt inherently unfair. They poisoned wells, ensuring that what little water you found would bring sickness. They sabotaged stoves, condemning you to the crushing cold. They even rigged latrines to explode, turning moments of desperate relief into sudden lethal traps. It was a war without rules, fought by an enemy who seemed to know every inch of the land, every weakness in your overextended lines. You recall vividly the sight of a captured partisan boy, perhaps no older than 17. His face dirt-streaked, his eyes wide but unblinking. He calmly endured beatings, his gaze fixed and unreadable, betraying no fear, no pain, no surrender. His stoicism was terrifying, a testament to an unwavering resolve that seemed to mock your efforts to break him. It was a chilling glimpse into the depths of their dedication, a reminder that their fight was born not of military doctrine but of something far more primal and deeply personal. The High Command, in their endless effort to understand and combat this elusive enemy, issued pamphlets How to Spot a Partisan. They contained absurd drawings depicting villagers with too quiet expressions or eyes that dart sideways. The irony was bitter. You were supposed to identify an enemy who looked exactly like the terrified silent civilians you encountered daily and whose very existence was a masterclass in blending in. It was a ludicrous exercise reinforcing the sense of fighting ghosts. Yet among your own ranks, there were those who developed an almost supernatural intuition. There was Franz, for instance, a quiet member of your platoon who seemed to possess a tingle. He could sense partisans, a subtle shift in the air, a whisper of unease that saved your lives more than once. He would suddenly stop, cock his head, and point silently into the woods, and sure enough, a hidden ambush would be discovered, a concealed sniper nest exposed. These moments reinforced a strange quiet belief in intuition, in instincts beyond logic, a desperate grasp for anything that might offer an edge against the unseen. You learned over time to read the forest itself, to interpret its subtle signs. A broken branch that seemed two fresh silent birds, where there should be chirping fresh boot prints, where there should be none. These became a language of danger, a silent warning system. The psychological warfare waged by the partisans was perhaps even more effective than their direct attacks. They fought with dread, leaving behind chilling messages, a comrade's helmet hanging conspicuously from a tree branch with no body beneath it. It was worse somehow, this absence, this silent mocking testament to a life taken without even the dignity of a body to bury. It implied a methodical, almost artistic cruelty playing on your fears rather than simply attacking your lines. And then came the orders from command forcing you to become villains in your own story. To clear areas, which often meant burning forests and entire villages to deny shelter and resources to the partisans. You watched horrified as homes built with generations of love and labor went up in smoke, their wooden frames collapsing in on themselves. You saw a squad mate, a quiet religious man, forced to burn a sacred church, its ancient icons and wooden cross reduced to ash. Later, he vomited his body racked with dry heaves, and he became utterly silent for days, a profound internal wound inflicted by the very act he was commanded to perform. In one abandoned partisan hideout, you found a diary. It contained entries not of grand strategic movements, but of lost family, of ruined crops, of starving winters, and a crude drawing of a boy. It was a stark, humanizing glimpse into the enemy's world, a reminder that on the other side of the battlefield there were people with lives, losses, and loved ones, just like you. And in the depths of winter, the Soviets themselves became ghostly figures. Their winter camouflage made them nearly invisible, gliding like vapor through the snow, vanishing into blizzards, becoming one with the environment, a truly terrifying embodiment of the general winter itself. They were masters of their landscape, and you, the invader, were merely a transient struggling presence, easy prey for both the land and its people. Amidst the relentless inhumanity of the Eastern Front, there existed fleeting, precious moments of shared compassion, small acts of human connection that defied the brutal reality. These were the whispers of sanity, the brief flickers of light in an otherwise overwhelming darkness. You witnessed and sometimes participated in these quiet acts of defiance against the dehumanizing forces of war. There was a comrade, a quiet, melancholic artist in another life, who after a particularly brutal engagement would sit in the grim quiet of the aftermath, sketching the faces of fallen soldiers. Not just your own men, but sometimes the enemy too. He gave you once a small charcoal sketch of a young Russian soldier, his face peaceful in death. It was a poignant, tender act, an attempt to remember them, to give them a brief moment of dignity to acknowledge the human lives extinguished by the conflict. It was in its own way a silent protest against the anonymity of death. You remember once, after successfully capturing a Soviet bunker, finding it untouched. Inside there were personal items, a half-finished chessboard, a pair of worn mittens, a small, crude carving. Your squad leader, a hardened veteran, simply gestured for everyone to leave them be. It was the most human thing done all week, a silent acknowledgement of the enemy's shared humanity, a refusal to desecrate their private spaces, their fragile remnants of ordinary life. It was a rare unspoken truce in a war that offered no quarter. You recall watching a Soviet soldier under heavy fire, gently tending to a wounded comrade, his movements careful, almost tender. Your finger was on the trigger, the opportunity there, but you couldn't pull it. The pure, unadulterated act of compassion, the shared human experience of care, transcended the enemy lines, freezing your hand, making the act of killing impossible in that moment. Later, you even gave water to a wounded, silent Soviet prisoner left behind during a hasty retreat. A small, quiet gesture that spoke volumes in its simplicity. In the cramped, freezing shelter of a ruined barn, you shared a scavenged bottle of vodka with your comrades. The raw, fiery liquid burned its way down your throat, but the shared laughter, the brief communal warmth generated by the alcohol and the camaraderie, felt like a powerful antidote to the pervasive misery. It was a fleeting moment of joy, a reminder that even here in this hell human connection could still bloom. One indelible memory is of a farmer, his face lined with hardship, but his eyes surprisingly clear, who simply gave you a heel of bread as you passed his ravaged farmhouse. He asked for nothing in return, no payment, no gratitude, just a silent accepting gesture. It was the most human moment in a week, a profound act of charity that defied the very nature of the war, a stark contrast to the violence and deprivation. And then the sound of music. In the shattered remnants of a deserted house, you found a ruined phonograph. With painstaking effort, someone managed to get it to play a waltz, a distant, tinny melody that seemed to float out of another world. For a few precious moments, the men simply listened, allowing the melody to carry them away from the brutal reality, to transport them to dance halls, to warm homes, to a time before the war devoured everything. It was a brief, shared escape, a collective sigh of relief in the face of unrelenting sorrow. You witnessed the heartbreaking scene of a dying comrade delirious with fever, convinced he was back home speaking of his mother and his sweetheart. You and others simply played along, whispering reassurances, humoring his last moments of peace. It felt like the kinder thing to do to allow him this final, comforting illusion, a gentle farewell from a world that had offered him so little comfort in life. When a comrade fell frozen and lifeless, you would cover him with a blanket, however thin, however inadequate. It felt like something, a small symbolic act of respect, a recognition of a life extinguished, a gesture against the crushing indifference of the landscape. And you knew, if you were lucky enough to escape with frost-bitten feet, that your boots would be left behind, a practical yet compassionate act, ensuring that someone else, however desperate, might find a momentary relief from the cold. A dried apple shared with a comrade tasted not of fruit, but of memory, a fleeting echo of better times. And the youngest soldier in your trench, a mere boy humming lullabies in the quiet dark, kept everyone warm, a soft, innocent sound that defied the harsh realities of their shared existence. Beyond the immediate visceral acts of human connection, There were also subtle, often unspoken moments of reflection stirred by mundane objects or unexpected sights. These quiet insights offered glimpses into the inner lives of both friend and foe, highlighting the shared human condition beneath the layers of uniform and ideology. You remember the face painted on the side of a downed Soviet biplane, a crude, grinning caricature. You stared at it for a long time, unsure whether it was supposed to be funny, horrifying, or simply an absurd, defiant gesture. It was a bizarre, almost surreal image, a flash of something artistic and human in the midst of mechanical destruction, leaving you with a lingering, unsettling impression. In a captured Soviet trench amidst the usual detritus of war, you found a small, worn book of poetry. Tucked inside a faded photograph of a girl, her smile soft and inviting. You kept it not out of any sentimental attachment to the enemy, but as a silent connection, a poignant reminder that the people you were fighting also had lives, loved ones, and moments of quiet beauty. It was a tiny, fragile bridge across the vast chasm of conflict. Similarly, in the pocket of a fallen Soviet soldier, you discovered a photograph of a dog. Just a simple, unadorned picture of a loyal canine companion. You stared at it for 5 minutes, transfixed, a profound moment of connection, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared affection, shared experience, shared loss. This dog, this simple animal, became a powerful symbol of the universal human longing for companionship and normalcy. Stalingrad, that city of grinding horror, offered its own surreal moments of quiet observation. You remember finding a cat remarkably scrounging through the rubble. Its movements were fluid, unburdened by the weight of fear or command. You envied it deeply, its freedom to simply leave, to slip away from the crumbling buildings and the endless cycle of violence, a silent, agile witness to a world going mad. Another soldier, in a moment of desperate defiance against the pervasive noise, found a violin in the ruins. He couldn't play it well. The sounds he produced were terrible, scraping off-key laments. Yet no one told him to stop. His terrible music was a testament to the enduring human need for expression. However flawed, however discordant, a defiant melody against the ceaseless cacophony of war. As your unit continued its relentless, grinding retreat westward, you came across a Cyrillic signpost, perhaps marking the edge of a village. Someone with a grim sense of irony had scrawled "end" and "nowhere" in German across its weathered surface. You reached out, touching the rough wood, feeling the cold, silent truth of those words. Then you simply walked past it, continuing your march towards Berlin, not as a destination of triumphant arrival, but merely as a direction, a theoretical endpoint to this endless, agonizing journey. Stopping at a fresh, clean wooden cross beside the desolate road marking an unknown grave, you found yourself touching it, whispering a prayer. Not necessarily a formal prayer, but a quiet, heartfelt plea for peace, for an end to the suffering, a moment of profound shared grief for the anonymous dead. It was a small, silent ritual, a way of acknowledging the countless lives lost, the personal tragedies that unfolded unseen, unheard. In a stripped, abandoned chicken coop, you pocketed a single vibrant chicken feather, a tiny, fragile reminder of color, of life, of a home that now felt like a distant, impossible dream. It was a small, almost absurd act, but it connected you to something vital, something untainted by the horror. Conversely, you had to force yourself to look away quickly from a child's abandoned toy in a ransacked house, its innocence a stark, painful contrast to the brutality that had swept through. These small objects, these fragments of forgotten lives, were potent reminders of the human cost, the shattered innocence that this war devoured without mercy. The profound disconnect between the high command and the lived reality of the soldiers was a chasm that widened with every kilometer you marched eastward and every step you took in the grinding retreat. From afar, the high command harbored an optimism that bordered on delusion. Historians you often overheard officers whisper with a bitter edge would endlessly debate whether German high command genuinely understood the devastating impact of the Russian autumn, the mud, the cold, the logistical nightmares it wrought. From your vantage point, with your feet sinking into another glacial puddle, the answer was a resounding, painful no. Their understanding, their meticulous plans proved spectacularly wrong, and it was the soldiers on the ground who paid the price for that fatal optimism. Generals you imagined read maps from 5,000 feet up, tracing elegant lines of advance with clean, well-manicured fingers. But you, the infantryman, felt those maps with your blistered, bleeding feet, each contour, each swamp, each frozen river, a testament to physical agony. Their paper plans, their theoretical successes, bore no resemblance to the brutal immediate reality that consumed your every waking moment. Orders arrived from someone 50 miles behind the line, from men who acted as if everything was perfectly fine, as if the front was a neat, orderly affair rather than a chaotic, freezing, starving hell. Hitler's own oversight, his stubborn refusal to adequately equip his troops for the brutal Russian winter, remains a subject of bitter historical debate. Was it arrogance, a deeply ingrained belief in the superiority of German will over the forces of nature? Or was it simply a profound criminal oversight, a failure of imagination on a catastrophic scale? For the soldiers, the distinction was meaningless. It manifested as inadequate clothing, frozen weapons, and the relentless, soul-crushing cold that gnawed at their very bones. The logistical failures were not just inconveniences. They were instruments of death as effective as any Soviet bullet. On paper, you were well-equipped. In reality, you were gnawing tree bark, scrounging for scraps of sustenance. The supply lines, those vital arteries, simply ghosted the soldiers, leaving you to improvise, to starve, to freeze. The meticulously efficient German supply system, designed for shorter, swifter campaigns in Western Europe, was utterly unsuited for the monstrous scale and brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. Trucks, those precious lifelines, were stuck every 5 minutes, their wheels spinning uselessly in the mud or bogged down in snowdrifts. Fuel froze solid in the lines, rendering vehicles immobile, turning tanks into expensive, very heavy paperweights. The pride of the Wehrmacht, the Panzer divisions, became an expensive, very heavy paperweight in the mud and snow, their speed and power negated by the elements. Their sophisticated engines, their intricate mechanics succumbed to the bitter cold and the viscous mud, leaving them stranded, vulnerable, and utterly useless. The much-touted Great Retreat, euphemistically described by High Command as repositioning or strategic withdrawal, was for the soldier no trumpet call to ordered withdrawal. It was a quiet, desperate shuffle westward, a grim, undeniable realization that the army comes back west as smoke and ghosts, never truly recovering, leaving behind a trail of frost-bitten, broken men. Useless orders would arrive commanding you to hold at the river, only to find that the river was already gone crossed, flanked, overwhelmed. The enemy pressing relentlessly, turning every defensive line into a fleeting, futile delay. The disconnect rippled through the ranks, subtly altering the very demeanor of your officers. Once they were crisp, confident, their voices booming with authority. Now you noticed they became quieter, their shouts replaced by hushed whispers. Their confidence, once so unwavering, seemed to dissipate into the cold air, replaced by a growing caution, a haunted look in their eyes that mirrored your own. An officer, once a paragon of discipline, might be seen sipping schnapps, not as a celebratory toast, but like medicine, a desperate attempt to dull the gnawing despair. Later, you'd observe him almost imperceptibly saluting you first, rather than demanding the salute, a small yet profound reversal of traditional military hierarchy, a quiet acknowledgement of shared suffering that transcended rank. You recall a young new commanding officer, barely 21 years old, arriving at the front in a fresh, uncreased uniform, his eyes still bright with a terrifying, naive belief in glory. He still spoke of victory, of heroism, of decisive battles. But his eyes, you noticed, were terrified. He was still caught in the grand narrative, while you and your comrades were far beyond it, existing only in the brutal immediate present of survival. And sometimes the disconnect became absolute, an officer simply disappearing into the swirling mist during a shelling never seen again, leaving his men to face the chaos alone. The silence of his departure was perhaps more profound than any spoken order, a quiet capitulation to the overwhelming pressures of the front. In stark contrast to your own army's struggles, the Soviet enemy demonstrated a resilience and adaptability that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. They possessed an unwavering spirit born from a profound, almost primal understanding of their land. They knew it intimately, like a butcher knows bone, and they used it as a formidable weapon against you. The German perception of them as inhuman, as having an unsettling indifference to losses, was rooted in their baffling tenacity. They took horrific casualties, entire units decimated, and yet they would continue to charge without self-preservation, throwing themselves at your lines with a fanaticism that defied all logic. But this wasn't just blind fanaticism. They were learning and adapting at an astonishing rate, shedding their initial disorganization. They pulled back, stretching your lines thin, creating vast, untenable distances, then slammed into you with devastating counterattacks. They used the terrain, the mud, the snow, the vastness of the forests, turning the very landscape into an ally. Their unwavering belief in Mother Russia as an endless source of resources and endurance became a source of profound fear for the Germans. They fought not with finesse or elegant tactics, but with an unyielding grit, throwing themselves against your bunkers, your defensive positions with a blunt, brutal force that eventually wore you down. The commissars, their political officers, were terrifyingly effective. They ensured their soldiers hated the enemy more than they feared death, instilling a fanaticism that drove men to fight with kitchen knives, with scavenged grenades, with anything they could lay their hands on. The Soviet war machine, while not elegant or precise, was relentlessly persistent. Bridges were rebuilt with astonishing speed, villages retaken with brutal efficiency, losses replaced with a seemingly infinite supply of men and material. They were like waves, winter, or time itself, unstoppable, relentless, utterly indifferent to your suffering. Crucially, the Soviets thrived in winter. They were, it seemed, born into it, moving with a natural ease in the sub-zero temperatures. Their proper winter gear, quilted jackets, felt boots, fur-lined hats, made them perfectly suited for the environment, allowing them to move like they belonged while you floundered. They didn't just survive winter. They utilized it to their advantage, becoming the conditions themselves, transforming the brutal landscape into an extension of their will. And then came their new weapons, the T-34 tanks, described by some as being made of hate and steel, shrugging off hits, terrifying you with their seemingly impenetrable armor and devastating firepower. As your morale sunk, Theirs seemed to rise, their growing confidence palpable, their laughter sometimes heard chillingly in the dark woods that surrounded you. Amidst the grand sweep of war, the relentless combat, and the brutal elements, there were also the quiet, often morally ambiguous encounters with civilians, those silent witnesses caught in the crushing gears of conflict. In the deserted villages you passed through, their faces were etched with hardship, their eyes bearing a hollow, unreadable gaze. You couldn't tell if they were afraid, angry, or simply utterly exhausted by the endless procession of soldiers, by the constant stripping away of their lives. There was no eye contact, no shared understanding, just a profound, unsettling blankness. You recall offering a piece of bread to a child, his small, emaciated face expressionless. He took it without a word, without a smile, and simply walked away, his silence more profound than any spoken thanks or curse. It was a moment that underscored the profound damage inflicted by the war, rendering even the most basic human interactions devoid of emotion, a stark reminder of the innocence lost perhaps forever. In a captured Soviet position, you might stumble upon a pot of warm soup still simmering over a low fire. You and your comrades would eat it without question, without even a flicker of consideration for its origin. It was sustenance, a fleeting moment of warmth, and in this world, that was all that mattered. Moral ambiguity simply dissolved in the face of raw hunger. You were a soldier, you took what you found, and you moved on. A surrendering Soviet scout once offered you sunflower seeds, a small, unexpected gesture of shared humanity across enemy lines. In that brief moment, the uniforms, the ideology, the conflict itself seemed to fall away, leaving only two men sharing a small, humble offering. It was a tiny, fragile truce, a glimpse of the ordinary life that existed, however briefly, beyond the scope of war. You saw an old woman incredibly sweeping her porch in a burning village as if the world around her wasn't collapsing into ash. She offered you a piece of dry cake, her face unsmiling, her eyes distant. It was an act of profound, almost surreal detachment, a quiet defiance against the chaos, a symbol of resilience that you found both baffling and strangely moving. The abandoned houses, stripped bare of anything of value, often held haunting remnants of lives, abruptly interrupted a child's toy, a doll, a wooden horse. You would catch a glimpse, a brief flash of lost innocence, and have to look away quickly, the image too painful, too stark, a reminder of what the war devoured without mercy. Being forced to burn a church, its sacred walls collapsing into flame, felt like a desecration of your own soul, turning you into a villain in your own story, forcing you to commit acts that fundamentally contradicted any lingering sense of morality. And in an abandoned Soviet field hospital, you lay on a cot for 10 minutes just to feel the brief illusion of being somewhere else, somewhere safe, somewhere clean, even if only in your imagination. These were the small, desperate acts of self-preservation, a mental escape from the overwhelming despair. The war, in its relentless, grinding totality, had a strange way of turning everyone into reflections of each other. Uniforms mattered less and less as mud, grime, and exhaustion made everyone look the same, blurring the lines between German and Soviet, between civilian and soldier. In the past towns, the civilians looked at you with a dull, flat gaze of people who have seen everything and expect nothing. You envied them paradoxically for their profound acceptance, their resignation to a fate that seemed in its own way to offer a strange form of peace. And when you encountered other retreating units, you recognized the shared suffering in their hollow eyes, in their slumped shoulders. You walked together, strangers in name, brothers in direction. A shared journey, into an uncertain, terrifying future. The war, in its brutal indifference, created an unexpected, painful bond, a silent brotherhood of suffering that transcended all previous divisions. The slow fade began with distant, barely audible rumors, whispers of high command surrender of the war finally cracking open, echoing through the exhausted ranks. But for you, the individual, there was no surge of joy, no relief. Just a profound, almost absolute low ache, a winding down as if the very gears of your being were finally slowing to a halt. Then came the ultimate silence, the cessation of orders, the end of the relentless marching, the blessed absence of artillery replaced only by the gentle sigh of the wind through broken trees, the soft chirping of unseen birds, and the quiet, ragged sounds of men finally allowing themselves to cry. You sit perhaps on a splintered stump, watching the last tendrils of wood smoke curl into the vast, indifferent sky, your hands twitching a phantom need to pat your coat for a comfort item, a salvaged whistle, a blue ribbon. And then the simple truth settles over you like a soft blanket. You made it, not to victory, not to glory, but through, and that's enough. The imaginary fire crackles softly before you, casting long, dancing shadows. Your boots, those heavy, wet anchors, are finally off their burden lifted. Your rifle lies quietly beside you, its brutal purpose for this moment suspended. Your shoulders hunched for so long against the cold, and the burden of command sag finally releasing the tension that has been your constant companion. You are not moving, not digging, not bracing for impact. You are just here in the quiet, sheltered space of this barn, the wind brushing against broken beams like a gentle lullaby. The thin blanket around you smells of smoke, old wool, and impossibly safety. Thoughts drift like snowflakes, clean rivers, steaming bread music without gunfire. You whisper your own name softly to remember it, to reclaim it from the long, silent erasure. Your fingers flex not from pain, but to simply feel them, to confirm their existence. The war, you realize, hasn't truly ended. But here for now, for this moment, it has paused. Let the quiet hold you, allowing the memory of who you were to settle in gently beside the version of who you became. May your dreams be soft and your rest deep. Sweet dreams.